expertise and cinematic expertise is what we identified. So one of the things we noticed about this period is that suddenly there seemed to be lots of films that were drawing on real case history material. Real published academic work from these fields of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. But also, as well as drawing on source material that was psychiatric, there was lots of interaction between expertise. Although psychiatrists and psychoanalysts had worked as consultants on films before, this was a period where we moved from a sense of sort of consultation to collaboration, where there's real sort of direct input into scripts and on set and so on and so forth within these types of films. So I've got a couple of examples of films here from the period that we're looking at. So this long 1960s period of the late 1950s into the early 1970s that we're looking at. So one of these films, for example, The Three Faces of Eve, a Hollywood film, which is based on a case history by two American psychiatrists, looking at a case of what then would have been called multiple personality disorder, now would be referred to as dissociative identity disorder. And it was based on real case history material that they had written. They were also consultants and collaborators on the film, and also appeared as characters within the film. So, we thought this is an interesting film in terms of how it really has this attempt to ground itself in psychiatric expertise and texts and so forth. And very much is a film which we would see as advocating for psychotherapeutic and psychiatric methods at the time. And then at the other end of our periodization, but also a British film, something like Family Life, which is a film by Ken Loach, produced by Tony Garnett. Again, a film based on real psychiatric case history material. In this case, the book Sanity, Madness and the Family by R.D. Laing and Aaron Esterson, figures associated what would now be referred to as the anti-psychiatry movement. Again, a film that was made in consultation and collaboration with Laing and Esterson and David Cooper, another radical psychiatrist at the time. And, different from, say, something like Three Faces of Eve, in that this is a film which was about critiquing and challenging psychiatric orthodoxy, about saying, particularly these modern physical interventions, so things like the use of ECT or the use of antipsychotic drugs and so forth. So this is a film that is about, as well as this idea of case history material and collaboration, we also see this as a period of marked by a lot of contestation as well, where films are trying to engage with and represent, in a more complex way, different forms of treating people and what they feel is the best way and so forth. And one of the unexpected findings of that first phase of the project was the significant role of psychiatric objects, of whether that be, something like the ECT machine here, or, psychometric tests and so forth. So there's lots of ways in which these objects and this material culture has a real important physical presence within these films, and often has a really important narrative function within these films. So more than just devices for authenticating or adding to this psychological realism, often these objects are used in really key and significant ways, either as part of the plot, as a plot device, or in other ways, as in something like Family Life, as a sort of rhetorical device or an ideological device to sort of hammer home a particular point of view. So that's something that we're interested in this next phase of the project. And you've got a couple of films here which we looked at in the context of Family Life as well, both which feature very similar uses and very detailed uses of ECT equipment, but do it for very different purposes, although very similar sort of aesthetically in terms of how they represent, and also how they seek to show the almost mundane, certainly routine use of these equipments, because of the way that they're used, have very different functions in the narratives, and also have very different effects on audiences. So these are two BBC texts. The Hurt Mind was intended to promote and advocate for new modes of modern psychiatric technique. And this had the desired effect. This is a film that was seen to largely work to desensitize audiences to the use of these new technologies. And actually, there was reports in BBC audience research shows that actually there was a real significant shift in people's perceptions of these types of technologies. And actually, there was letters in the British Medical Journal at the time which said they were concerned about how many people were coming forward after this particular TV broadcast to ask for ECT. So it had the desired effect here. In Two Minds, although again, this is the film, an earlier film by Ken Loach dealing with the same material as Family Life. This BBC play was seen very much to have the opposite effect of sensitizing audiences to basically the potential harm of some of these techniques and technologies. And this is, even though it looks very similar, this is to do with narrative placement, that actually by showing the effects that this particular technique and technology has on the particular character in the TV play, and then showing the ECT treatment after, it very much makes a case for, against this as a way to treat people. So this is the sort of thing that triggered us into thinking about how we wanted to look at some of these technologies and some of these objects and the way that they're used for these particular purposes, particularly these sort of ideological purposes within these texts. So this led us to start working with the Science Museum. So obviously, for those who've been to the Science Museum or know their collections, you may know that they've got this really great psychological collection, most of which, or some of which at least, is on display in the Welcome Galleries on the second floor of the museum in Kensington. And we wanted to use their object collection, and particularly the tangibility of their objects, to try and get new audiences for some of the research that we've done. But the Science Museum group themselves, they were really interested in collaborating with us because for a couple of different purposes, but particularly in terms of cross-collection dialogue. Because they have, as you may well be aware, there's a number of sites connected to the Science Museum group, but particularly in relation to our project, the Science Museum in Kensington, where you've got the psychiatry and psychology collections, and then the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, who we also worked with, who have the cinema and media collections. And the Science Museum said to us they find it quite difficult to make connections across those collections and get them collections to be in dialogue. So what they were interested in with our use of film here was seeing, as we hope to as well, using this as a mechanism to tell some sort of new and hidden and potentially entangled stories across those collections. And talking to Selena, who was going to be doing this presentation with me, she was talking about how the Science Museum hasn't used fiction film before, that they saw this as potentially problematic because they were worried that people might take it seriously, that people might take it as fact, even though these are fiction films. And we thought this was interesting because, we would want to have the same caution and concerns about not taking things too seriously, as it were. But also, we would raise the same questions about other forms of mediation that we would see, even if it was oral histories or if it was documentary material. We would still want to be asking the same questions and saying, is this how is this framed? How is this mediated? How is this telling a partial picture of this particular object or this particular moment, as it were? So we thought that was interesting, this sort of different distinction there. So I want to talk, I'm going to show you these three films and allow them to speak to these three aspects of the aims of the project. So firstly, as I said, the Science Museum was interested in this idea of cross-collection dialogue. So the first film I'm going to show you, I'm going to hopefully will speak to some of these aspects that we were seeking to address, particularly trying to seek a dialogue between the cinema and medical media collections and the medical collections. Secondly, we're going to have a think about this idea of intersecting histories, and to think a little bit about the ways in which bringing in popular culture, the way that we're bringing in wider public perceptions might add something to the histories of these objects beyond their intended uses, I suppose. And then finally, I want to speak explicitly to my discipline, which is media studies and film studies, and think a little bit about how drawing expertise from museum studies and from the curators at the Science Museum has allowed us to rethink maybe some of our perspectives in terms of using an objects-focused approach to film and media studies. So I'm going to start off with the first film and stop talking and let you watch something that we've made, which focuses on the sand trays that are used within what's called what's called her world technique, which you will see. And these sand trays, as I'll go on to talk about, are something that are displayed in the treatment section of the Wellcome Galleries. So I'm going to show you that first film now.
What's all that for?
He's making his world. Would you like to make a world too?
Perhaps.
Then you shall.
From cinema's invention in the late 1890s, filmmakers have sought to capture children's inner worlds and inner experiences. And this goes back to one of the first films ever screened, Lumiere's film of his infant son, Andre. In the post-war period in particular, filmmakers sought to really seriously engage with some of the developments in child psychology, in attachment theory, and particularly some of the findings about the effects of separation during wartime on children. The 1950s film No Place for Jennifer can certainly be understood in the context of this post-war research into attachment and separation with children. But what's interesting about the film is that it actually looks to Margaret Lowenfeld, and particularly her world technique, as a way to express a child's inner world.
I see there are a lot of wild animals prowling among the traffic. Now, I wonder what this tiger's doing.
I don't know, really, but he belongs somehow. He's dangerous.
Margaret Lowenfeld is a really interesting figure in the history of child psychology. She developed new techniques to help children express what they couldn't in words. Her world technique was really focused on a sand tray, which was always the same size and same shape, that would be filled with wet sand and another one with dry sand. So the child was free to do exactly what they wanted to do. She would always say to them, make what's in your mind. So she would never try to influence the child in any way, and she'd always use the words that they used to describe what they were creating.
Sometimes you live with your mummy, and sometimes you live with your daddy.
Yes, they both make a fuss about me, but they don't really mind what happens to me. Nobody does.
No Place for Jennifer looks at the traumatic effects of separation and divorce on a young girl, and then shows you how she is treated when she goes to the Institute of Child Psychology, based on the real institute in which Margaret Lowenfeld worked.
Well, we've got her over the first hurdle. She's told me quite a lot about herself. Is it going to be a difficult case? I'm afraid it'll take some time.
The process of making a world is as important as the end result itself. Children were encouraged to get messy, to play, to really express their emotions in a way that was non-verbal and a way that was meaningful to them.
Through the film, we see her go through these stages of chaos and struggle and resolution as she first builds a world which is marked by disorder and chaos through the placement of wild animals within the domestic setting. What we see through montage, through dissolves and through dialogue is her moving to this position of resolution within the film, where her world becomes more ordered and seemingly her inner world also becomes more ordered.
I think it's the best world I've ever made, don't you?
I see the tiger's gone.
Yes, I think he rather spoiled it.
Yes, he made it dangerous, didn't he? Jenny, do you remember the first world you made?
Yes, it was an awful muddle.
Rather a frightening sort of muddle, but that's how you were feeling inside then. Now, look at today's world. That's a happy sort of place, isn't it?
Yes, it's lovely there. It's lovely here, too.
Margaret Lowenfeld is a really forgotten figure in the history of child psychology, and that's because a lot of her ideas about the way children think and their emotions and how they're expressed kind of ran counter to the psychoanalytical trends that were going on, that were particularly inspired by Sigmund Freud. So it's really interesting that a film like No Place for Jennifer picks Lowenfeld and her techniques to explore in this way. It's a way of talking about emotions through toys. So as Margaret Lowenfeld said, toys are their language.
Okay, great, brilliant. And everyone, do put any questions, by the way, if you think of any along the way, in the Q&A section, which we'll talk about at the end of this session. So do feel free, and it'd be interesting to see, as I show the films, if these are films that you're aware of or familiar with, and maybe your take on some of these films as well. So as Selina said in her VT there, Margaret Lowenfeld is this quite underappreciated figure in the history of the sciences, and that's partly the reason why the Science Museum chose to focus on her when they built the Wellcome, or rebuilt the Wellcome galleries a few years back, to try and use it as a space to tell her story, and to tell her sort of a revisionist history, particularly of child psychology and her central role in that. So it's interesting that, and as Selina said, she was interested that this film focused on her. Does that tell us something about that? Maybe she did have more resonance in particular fields at this time, as well. So we were sort of quite interested in this. So not only that they chose Margaret Lowenfeld, but also the fact that they seem to put such care into trying to accurately represent not only her technique and the way that her technique is talked about, but also the space of the Institute of Child Psychology. So this wasn't filmed on location, this was a set that was built. And as you can see from some of the pictures in the top half and some of the pictures in the lower half, there was a real attention to detail in trying to really authentically and accurately depict this space, but also in terms of casting as well, in terms of casting what's referred to as the Doctor, in this, rather than by name, that there's a real sense of an attempt to authentically depict what goes on in the institute and how Margaret Lowenfeld works. So we thought that was sort of quite interesting there. But in terms of this idea of intersecting collections or intersecting worlds that we're looking at, we thought that Lowenfeld's world technique itself is quite interesting, that it is itself the product of intersection of the world of psychiatry and the world of popular culture. So Margaret Lowenfeld's inspiration for the world technique came from H.G. Wells, not from his science fiction work, but from a popular book he wrote called Floor Games, which was about games that kids play. But also the very fact that the Lowenfeld technique and its popularization was made possible by mass-produced toys from the start of the 20th century onwards, that this was about easily accessibility, that, as a therapist, you could get hold of this stuff quite easily to build this technique. So it's sort of quite non-elitist, quite non-proprietary, in a different way to something like, say, the Rorschach tests, which are like a heavily guarded thing in terms of their production and use within psychiatry, for example. So again, you've got this intersection there. But also you can see this quote from Margaret Lowenfeld, hopefully, which she gave in 1937 at the British Psychological Society, presenting in front of, this is where Jung first experienced her method. And you can see that she talks very much about how children draw upon this cinematic imagination, that their imagination drawn from film serials as well, that this is something that seems to feature in the way that they build their worlds and the way that they tell stories through seriality and so forth. So there's this sort of interesting connection here between pop culture and psychiatric culture at the very heart of the world's technique. This is also a time, although Margaret Lowenfeld doesn't, this is a time that other of her contemporaries, people like Margaret Mead, are using film. The availability of 16mm film technologies and the more affordability of that is allowing child psychologists particularly to record mother-infant interaction on film and to use that to study and use it in treatment and so forth. So there's also this intersecting cultures there in that respect. I want to think a little bit more about this intersection of where filmmakers are drawing their ideas from as well. That filmmakers seem to have this particular, as I talk a bit about in the film, seem to be particularly interested in this post-war period of thinking about children's inner worlds and about the effects of things like separation and attachment on them. So Firstly, in terms of thinking about this, in terms of Margaret Lowenfeld and her use in this film, this does at least initially come from the book. So the book that No Place for Jennifer is based on, Phyllis Hambleton's book, No Difference to Me, does have a chapter which was written with help from the Institute of Child Psychology, which details the, and reproduces what you see on screen to some extent in terms of the use of the world's technique within the narrative. But the film seems to take this even further. For one, in the book, this is stalled and that she doesn't complete her treatment, but also it doesn't have the same narrative function at the very center of the film that it does in No Place for Jennifer. So there is a real investment in, this completed treatment that Jennifer undergoes, of really demonstrating the value of it within the film. So that's something that's sort of interesting for us. But I also want to talk a little bit about other techniques within the film that you don't see so much of in the film that we made, which comes from a much more prevalent use of Freudian imagery and ideas in film. So particularly the Freudian dream sequence. So as you obviously likely already know, Freud was very interested in dreams as being this key tool for accessing unconscious fears and accessing unconscious desires. And film really took this up from the sort of mid-20s onwards, really, but particularly into the 1940s and then 50s, the Freudian dream sequence that used this idea of double exposure or superimposition was probably the key mechanism in film for representing inner worlds, for giving us access to what was going on psychologically for people. And this is interesting for us because this, again, this involves the reason that this becomes so prevalent, again, is about intersection. It's about the intersection of a popularization of Freudian ideas at the same time as it suddenly becomes possible more cheaply, more effectively, to do this superimposition technique. So the invention during the Second World War of these commercially accessible optical printers, like you see in the picture here, made it so films like Spellbound, for example, probably the most famous dream sequence in film, designed by Salvador Dali for Hitchcock's film, that this becomes possible not only in Hitchcock's films, but across a range of Hollywood and British films to do this superimposition technique. So we thought that was interesting here, that you've got this intersection of worlds, of the world of cinematic technology and the world of psychiatric and psychological ideas and technique as well. So that's the sort of first section I wanted to talk about. I'm now going to move on for our second object, which is the electroencephalograph, or the EEG, which is the titular brain machine of the next film, and to show you that, to think a little bit about this idea of historicity.
What's this, Mum?
An electroencephalograph.
Yes, but what does it do?
So what is EEG? EEG stands for electroencephalography. This machine is able to detect very tiny signals emitted by neurons in our brain as they talk to each other and communicate with each other. And this machine detects those tiny signals, amplifies them, and then produces a graph that records the activity of the different frequency and fluctuations of those brain waves.
As the EEG became more prominent in medical and research settings in the late 1930s and early 1940s, it also started to infiltrate popular culture. The 1955 British film, The Brain Machine, is really interesting though, because it makes the EEG, or the brain machine of the narrative, into the star. And not only that, but also seeks to try and meld science fact and science fiction together.
Now, there's no need to worry, Mr. Jarrett. You won't feel anything. Just relax.
So the EEG machine was used at the Burden Neurological Institute in the late 1950s. It was set up by Rosa Burden, who funded this institute to carry out new clinical research into neurological and psychiatric disorders.
In the film, Dr. Philippa Roberts is a psychiatrist, and she uses the EEG to do research in a number of contexts, but particularly within the film context, she uses it as a way to distinguish between aggressive behaviour caused by brain tumours and aggressive behaviour caused by congenital defects, potentially linked to things like criminal psychopathy.
Now, I'm going to put on a light, Mr. Jarrett. Don't let it worry you.
And whilst this might seem like a fantastical plot narrative, actually there is some historical grounds to this, because the EEG was used by people like Dennis Hill at the Maudsley to investigate if there was particular traits of the criminal psychopath within their brainwaves that could identify them.
What happened? You all right, Mum?
Yes, you just grabbed my wrist, that's all.
When we think of EEG today, we think of it as a non-invasive technique, but actually the work going on at the Burden Neurological Institute was much more invasive. This machine was used to produce the first EEG graph of a patient with epilepsy in the late 1950s. And actually that patient went on to have a lobotomy, a part of their left side of their brain removed. And if you look to the right of the machine, you can see a photostrobic lamp. So this was a lamp that was emitting 30 flashes of light per second. And that was used again to study how that light maybe induce seizures into patients as well.
Come on, let's get on with it.
Be in such a hurry, Smith.
What's it all about, anyway?
We'll see. Just lie still.
The film's interested in the way that it seeks to ground its narrative in historical accuracy. It foregrounds the EEG as a female expertise, and this links to what is going on at the Burden Institute, where women's labour is absolutely central to EEG research at the time.
I can look after myself, so if you don't mind.
Yes, Mum.
Would you mind calling me doctor, not ma'am?
Certainly, Doctor.
As you can imagine, research in the 1940s and 1950s really centred on a lot of male researchers. But actually at the Burden Neurological Institute, many of the individuals working as technicians, as psychiatrists, as researchers were women. Individuals like Vivian Walter, whose work enabled the first brain tumours to be identified using EEG. It was a really important place and space for women carrying out really amazing work that tends to be written out of history, so it's really great to be able to bring their role and their significance back in with this research into neurological activity in the brain.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I just so you can see obviously in the film there, in the Science Museum, that there's a big cabinet with a lot of EEG technology on display, a lot of the stuff that was used in the Burden Institute in the 40s and 50s. And as is talked a bit about in the film, and you also see a reference here to an article in the Science Museum Journal, the film and our research here does, we feel, contribute to this revisionist history of the Burden particularly, and EEG use as well in this country, in terms of thinking about women's role within that, about the absolute centrality of women's labour at places like the Burden in things like epilepsy research. You know, people like Vivian Walters, Janet Shipton, and so on and so forth. So here we see an intersection of our historical interests and the historical interests of the Science Museum Group, again, in terms of trying to foreground this aspect of science history. But also I want to pick up on a smaller point which I'm making in the film briefly, which is around an alternative use or potentially an alternative misuse of the EEG, which is what the film, The Brain Machine, is about, really, the use of these technologies in trying to identify criminals or identify criminal psychopaths. And as I talked a little bit about in the film, this does have a historical grounding, that there was attempts to use this technology by people like Dennis Hill and William Sargent at the Maudsley, but also within prisons at the time in the 40s and into the 50s, to try and use this machine to identify if there was certain brainwave patterns of criminals, of potential psychopaths, and so on and so forth. And what you can see in this picture is one of those EEGs, which was used by Dennis Hill at the Maudsley. This is part of the Science Museum's collection, but is not something that is on display, and is not a history that they necessarily foreground, as many historians don't really talk about or identify this use at the time of the EEG, or this misuse at the time of the EEG in this particular way. But it's really important to this film. So the title, The Brain Machine, and its narrative is really grounded in what was a very public media discourse at the time about what they call, the brain machine, which is where this title comes from. So in this period, so you've got a number of newspaper articles you can see on the left here from the early to mid 1950s, which are all based around this media discourse and where this term, the brain machine, is popularized in terms of this debate about using this device as a method for detecting criminals, for using in insanity defenses and so forth. And there's a lot of contestation at the time about, whether this is ethical, whether this is accurate, and and what the implications of this are. But you can see why a film like The Brain Machine, a crime film, would draw on this version of the EEG, this very sort of, popularized discourse around it at the time. And you can see how that then also factors into some of the promotion for the film, with like encouraging you here on the right for newspapers to put in this article about how you can identify between normal brainwaves and murderers' brainwaves through this technique and so forth. So, yeah, so we thought this was interesting here, that, that the brain machine, it simultaneously seems to be responding to and contributing to this media and public perception of the EEG as predominantly a machine used on criminals. And the film seems to make this visible. This isn't something that comes out much in histories of the EEG, but this is what the public thought this device was used for. This is what the media largely foregrounded that this device was used for. So here is an example of how, this type of research can add to making visible some of these additional or alternative stories about a particular technology. I'm going to finish up with one more film, which is about the straitjacket, an object which is on display in a number of which are display in the medical isolation section of the Wellcome Galleries. And to do that, at least as a starting point, we're using the 1966 film Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment, to think a little bit about the use of the straitjacket in different ways. So this is the last film I'm going to show you and talk to you a little bit about.
One of these days they'll be coming for me with a straitjacket.
The straitjacket looks really straightforward. When we look at it, we can see the shape of a human body, somebody being restrained, perhaps for their own safety or to protect other people. But as is so often the case with the history of medicine, it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. The straitjacket was first invented in late Georgian times, and it was seen as somehow a kinder and more humane way of caring for what we would now call psychiatric patients or mental health service users.
I believe my mental condition's extremely illegal.
From the beginning of the 1910s, the straitjacket entered popular culture through escapology, and particularly through the spectacular escape stunts undertaken by Harry Houdini. Around the same time, the straitjacket also started to appear in psychological horror films. So probably the most famous of these is the 1920 German expressionist film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In the 1960s, the straitjacket also started to take on some additional countercultural connotations. So a good example of this is the 1966 British comedy film Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment.
You have grown into a peculiar sort of a fella, Morgan.
In this film, the central character, Morgan, he's an artist who is currently divorcing from his wife because she's become sick of his erratic behaviour and frequent flights into fantasy.
I did go and see a psychiatrist today.
I hope he told you to return my car.
He goes to see a psychiatrist who tells him that he is a suitable case for treatment, but he ignores his psychiatric advice and goes on to try and keep winning back his wife through these increasingly surreal stunts. In the film's conclusion, Morgan is washed up on Battersea Docks dressed as a gorilla. Then he's put in a straitjacket and hoisted above Battersea Docks in this straitjacket and lowered down to face a firing squad made up of his friends, family, and Russian revolutionaries. And this scene's interesting because clearly it evokes these ideas that Morgan is perceived to be mad in the eyes of society and psychiatry, but it also takes on these other connotations that we get from Houdini, this idea of madness almost as a form of escape.
Medical professionals have considered restraints more generally as something that was very much up for debate, really from the 19th century onwards, where other techniques, such as what we would now call rehabilitation, were much more popular. Moving forward into the 20th century, the idea of restraints for psychiatric patients continued to be a massive issue for debate. People really questioned who was in control, who was giving over their power, and why.
One of these days they're going to come and take me away, and you wish you'd been a bit more human.
The emergent anti-psychiatry movement not only fought against the use of coercive treatments like the straitjacket, but also questioned the very nature of madness and thought about madness in the context of it being a rational response to some of the pressures and some of the restrictions of society. And this countercultural use of the straitjacket was then taken up by other subcultures, so particularly punk in the 1970s. The straitjackets continue to have these resonances, and particularly to resonate with this idea of it being a symbol of societal control. And that's something that's been taken up by hip-hop culture. So whether it be Tupac or Eminem, or more recently someone like Lil Wayne's video for Crazy, which itself is a pastiche of the most famous anti-psychiatric film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, great. So final film there. So and I just want to use this one to just speak for a couple of minutes about current work I'm doing, which is trying to think about what my field, so film studies, media studies, can learn from museum studies, from professional curators like those at the Science Museum, and particularly about how bringing an object's perspective to bear on media might offer a different perspective on that. So we're focusing here on the straitjacket as the film shows. And you might see this as maybe the odd one out in terms of what we've looked at. So at least the first two devices, the Lowenfeld's sand trays, the EEG, are largely objects to make patients' inner worlds more visible, to externalize that. Whereas what we're looking at here is an object which is largely about restricting the interaction of a patient and their inner world with the external world. And for that reason is, partly why, as we show in the film, this has been taken up as this potent symbol and this quite complex symbol of various forms of struggle and coercion. And in the film, we tell this obviously quite a simple narrative from Houdini to hip hop, quite a linear narrative of, how the straitjacket takes on this subcultural connotations. But it's much more complex, obviously, than that. The straitjacket continues to, with all these new articulations, continues to build meaning and add to that meaning. It continues to, at the heart of it, to contain this contestation between the idea of it being simultaneously a representation of the danger of the system, but also a danger of the wearer as well. So it's quite a complex symbol in that respect. And for me, I've looked at the work of someone like Caitlin Benson-Allert, who is someone who's interested in objects, but particularly more sort of cinematic objects, as a way to think about different forms or messier forms of media history and film history. But I think bringing these medical objects in can also offer a new perspective on that as well. So you've got some images here on screen from the 1990s, a period when largely the straitjacket is no longer being used in America in psychiatric settings, but continues to build on and add to and re-articulate some of these meanings that we see from, going back from Caligari to Houdini and so on and so forth, and punk, but to reframe that in relation to contemporary issues and concerns around gender, around perceptions of mental health, around race and ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So I think there's something here by thinking across mediums and media that can be useful if we focus in on something like the straitjacket, for example. And just to finish up on that, I want to look at a moment that I don't really look at, or we don't really talk much about in the film about the straitjacket, which is this immediate post-war period that's associated with the beginning of what we would call deinstitutionalization, a move to move people outside of mental institutions and into things like care in the community and so forth, and treatment outside of those settings. And the straitjacket there, and particularly the image of women in straitjackets, is absolutely central to this immediate post-war period. So we get these exposés, particularly this particularly important one, which was in Life magazine, called Bedlam 1946, came out in 1946, which was very much about saying, do you know what's still going on in these places? And it's something that other films, including things like Psycho, speak to in their narratives about, do you know what goes on in those places, for example? But this this use of the straitjacket is really central at this time to this discourse and this debate and this move to encourage America to reflect on what is happening in its, in the country at the time and in its institutions. So on the right-hand side here, you've got some images all from 1948, which are themselves building on and responding to what you get in Life magazine here. So from something like this very influential and important journalistic account, The Shame of the States, from Albert Deutsch, award-winning journalist, to a Hollywood film like The Snake Pit, also 1948. These are really seen as really important text in terms of encouraging the public to see what is happening and to get them to support this idea of deinstitutionalization. But even in comics aimed at younger audiences, perceived, inverted commas, less educated audiences are also part of this debate. You can see in this comic here, Lawbreakers, the quote at the bottom there: "This is all the proof I need to bust open wide this phony sanitarium racket." So again, the ways in which the straitjacket is being marshaled across these different spaces as a way to argue against the system, to say that this is an unjust and unfair and exploitative system. However, it's more complex than this. Although we do have this across different forms of media and mediums, we've got these articulations, there's also counter discourses there. So also from 1948, we've got a film like White Heat, starring James Cagney. And this is a film in which he feigns, or supposedly sort of feigns madness to get out of prison and to be institutionalized. And he exploits the perceived liberal nature of mental institutions to have a gun hidden in his straitjacket and to escape and get back into the world. So an interesting film here, something like White Heat, which is a film which is arguing for more institutionalization, arguing for more incarceration, arguing against the liberal nature of the mental health system in some ways. And again, a film that we wouldn't normally look at in relation to something like The Snake Pit. Very different genres, very different types of films, but interesting how they're both articulating and being debating this same issue. So I'm going to finish up there. And again, I would love to have any comments and questions. This is ongoing work. I wanted to show you a few of the ways that we're trying to use film in conjunction with, or as a way to bridge some of these different collections in museums, but also as thinking a little bit about the way we're using objects and film together and using the intersecting methods of the study of both of these together as a way to prompt new questions and to prompt new stories. Just to say, for those of you who are interested and want to look at some other work we're doing, if you look in the resources section, you'll find that there's also a link to what we're calling these objects and stories pages. So they're another way that we're, they're from the Science Museum's web pages. They're these like blogs that seek to also do the same thing, to talk about different objects together, to use digitized object images alongside digitized film, to try and tell new stories and pose new questions. So if you're on YouTube, I don't think you can access those directly, but you'd have to come through the main platform to do that. But thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and return to me and to see if anybody has any questions. Okay. Someone said ignore this question now. Okay. Okay, great. So Ross, you talked a little bit about that. That's We don't know whether Margaret Lowenfeld directly had involvement in the writing of the chapter in the book, or whether she, whether Phyllis Hambledon got to spend time with her. What we do know is that that she did spend some time in the Institute of Child Psychology. So you would assume that probably she did have meetings with or interactions with Margaret Lowenfeld. But also, we haven't found anything explicitly about about whether the screenwriter spent time there or followed up. But certainly, it's something that I'm looking into and interested to find out, particularly given how accurately it depicts things like the water room and the mess room in the Institute of Child Psychology. Yes, sorry. Yeah, someone was just saying we didn't. Yeah, Ross's question was about whether we knew whether Margaret Lowenfeld had any direct involvement with either the novel or the film. Any other questions at all? So. Okay. Still try to keep an eye on the questions here. Okay. So if there's oh, okay, great. Question from the lobby that's just getting types. Nice, that's brilliant. Okay, but yeah, do take a look. So if anyone can come along and you want to see these films again, but in the context of the objects in which they're referring to, alongside lots of other interesting stuff. So I know that for one, so it's on the 27th of July in London. It's a lates for the NHS at 75, but it's also an event around gaming as well. So there's going to be lots of other interactive stuff there. So if anyone's interested, do go on the website of the Science Museum, and you can come along and have a look around and get involved and interact both with the medical collections, but also with some of the work around gaming as well. Okay, so there. Okay, the role of museums and the BFI in making us think about the role of film, fiction in historical studies and more generally. So yeah. Obviously, yeah, the BFI are have long been, very centrally involved in, in promoting screen heritage and screen history. I don't believe they work that closely directly with, or have worked that closely with, the Science Museum in Kensington, for example. Much more closely with the Media Museum up in Bradford and across their history. But yeah, it's something that we were really interested by. And I think that was something that really was interesting for us when Selena and others said, that there'd always been this issue with using fiction film, and, the concern of how much it required it to be contextualized, and so forth. So yeah, so we thought that was, interesting, and certainly is something that since doing this project, they feel that there is more of a possibility to do that sort of work. We also look at another film from 1950, The Magnet, which is really interesting, which is simultaneously a film which deals with child psychology and psychiatric aspects, but it's also a film which is very much responding to the birth of the NHS, and is, it very much contrasts Freudian psychoanalysis to what is happening in medical terms with things like the iron lung. So this is it's a film about how they raise money for an iron lung for a non-NHS hospital at the time. So it's quite interesting how this period, there's these films that speak not only across film and medicine, but also explicitly talk across the medicine collection as well. So these are the sorts of things where there's potential here to use film in interesting ways to think about how these dialogues were working in the period. Okay, so I think the question is, should historians take more notice of film in their work? I'm going to say that, aren't I? Because I'm a sort of film and media historian. but yeah, I think it really does have its value and its place. And, you know, and certainly there's, you know, we would be cautious about making that distinction between certain types of film and media representation at the time as being necessarily any more explicitly accurate or factual than others. And at this period, when we're looking at something like No Place for Jennifer, you know, that is a film which is as much in dialogue with some of the documentaries at the time and some of the work coming out of, you know, of documentary film, Crown Film Unit and other documentary units, as it is in dialogue with other fiction films, you know. So I think there's definitely a sense in which, whilst historians have looked to, you know, some of that type of film content, and even some of the professionals and practitioners working across these films are simultaneously switching between those two registers, that they're making films for the NHS at the same time as they're making fiction films for, you know, for wider circulation. Can you say more about the audiences for these films, especially how they were received in professional periodicals and forums? Thanks, Sarah. That's really, yeah, I don't know if that's your question or a question in your forwarding, but that's really from Jim. That's really useful. Thank you. So as I said, I talked a little bit about that in relation to some of the anti-psychiatry films, and particularly some of the films that were explicitly engaging with things like ECT and, you know, and other biomedical techniques at the time and so forth. Those types of films often prompted a backlash rather than necessarily a welcomed intervention at the time from the professions. I haven't found a lot about these films explicitly, again, maybe partly because they are, you know, it's interesting, you know, these are very much genre films. You know, these are probably films that aren't considered to be prestige pictures, you know, in the way that something like The Snake Pit was, for example, or at the time, or the, you know, so it's there isn't a huge amount that I have been able to find so far about these three films in relation to their the perception of them within the professions. Film critics talk a little bit about that. Film critics talk a little bit about these films and whether they are valuable in that context or not. It's interesting that mostly particularly with something like No Place for Jennifer, is very split. You know, some people think this is an important and a valuable intervention given, you know, some of the recent research in attachment and so forth. But some people see this film as quite derivative and say there's been a number of films that have already dealt with this. So they see that film as part of a wider cycle and part of a wider, you know, they don't see it as something necessarily that's sort of unique and different. They see it as part of a you know, as part of a wider trend, and potentially as something that's exploiting and using child psychology, or using some of these recent medical findings as a way to, you know, to as a unique selling point to capture sort of audiences. But yeah, there's not a great deal in that respect, in the same way as there is about things like, for example, Three Faces of Eve or Family Life. But I'm still looking, and I'm still trying to seek out some of that stuff at the moment. Okay, any other last questions? Okay, well, we're coming up to the hour, so thank you so much for engaging, for watching these films, for having great questions. Please do get in contact with me. So Tim Snelson at UEA, you could just Google that and get my email address. So do get in contact if you want to ask any questions or follow up or find out about any of the events we're doing for this project. And please do sign up for the Society for History, British Society for the History of Sciences. You know, obviously this is a brilliant event. This is a brilliant festival that they're holding. There's lots more like this, so please do sign up, and please do, yeah, come along to more of the sessions in this particular festival. And thanks everyone for, yeah, making this happen. Cheers. Thanks very much.